Williams.
Mr Chairman, thank you. I've just been listening to the debate over this first part of the bill, and I wanted to wait to get a bit of a sense of some of the issues that members wanted to raise before I responded. So I want to go through a few of them. Calvin Davis in his contribution was asking the question about whether and how the regime would apply to someone who may have been deported for Australia who had no criminal convictions. And it's a fair point, and I want to make it very clear. I indicated and nodding and shaking my head that what was happening, but I thought that better to get it on the record. I want to be really clear about this. This bill is not about replicating the decisions Australia has made as to who should be deported. We don't take that into account. So if Australia deports someone because they're bad character, they say, or because they have some other concerns to Australia, that is not a trigger under this bill. The only thing that triggers the provisions in this bill are conviction for offending that in New Zealand would have been an imprisonable offence and for a minimum length of time. So let's, a couple of simple scenarios. If someone was convicted in, I happen to know that in Thailand it's an offence to insult the royal family. Well, that's fine, it's not an offence here, so clearly if that person were deported back, it wouldn't be triggered. Similarly, if a particular person in Australia is deported back to New Zealand who has no criminal charges or convictions, but for other reasons that the Australians obviously have to work through and to justify, they are not caught by this bill. This bill is not about being punitive and adding a layer. It's about trying to pick up exactly is too strong, in a similar way as possible, the conditions that offender would have been in had they served the same sentence in New Zealand. And that's why the test is always, have you served the minimum of a year in prison? Because that's the threshold we use for release conditions. Is it conduct that would have been prisonable in New Zealand? Because again, we're not going to impose someone else's standards. And if it is, then we need to mirror what we would do in New Zealand. The question was also asked about the 6 months, and the answer there is, I think I mentioned in one of my contributions, the member may not have been in the House earlier this evening or earlier today. The intent of the 6 months is to say that these conditions are about monitoring an offender while they reintegrate from a period of being incarcerated in an institution. Once they have been back in society for some time, the need is not the same. These people have served their sentence. This is about saying, as you come out from that very restricted environment, we know that is a very high-risk time for reoffending, and so we want to support and monitor and oversee these prisoners in the same way that they would have been in New Zealand. The call I had to make, and yes, it is a line call, you've got to put it somewhere, is if they have been out in the Australian community for more than 6 months, then that case can't be made in the same way that we need to help them with that reintegration. Within 6 months, we think the case can be made. However, the question was asked, well, what happens if they've been there for 7 months and they still need monitoring? The bill provides that if they come back to New Zealand and are subject to an ongoing monitoring regime, let's say they've got lifetime monitoring because there was serious concern in Australia they needed to be watched, then it enables the New Zealand authorities to go to the courts here and say, well, actually, in this case, we think it's made out, so would they look at it? It doesn't apply automatically, but there is that provision if they were subject to an ongoing monitoring regime. So the other point I just wanted to pick up on was Grant Robertson's contribution just immediately before I rose to my feet, talking about issues like health and education and housing, and actually it feeds back to Calvin Davis's points as well around reintegration and the difficulties that some of these offenders are likely to have reintegrating, given that for some of them, not all of them, but for some of them they have very few, if any, ties to New Zealand. And it's a very valid concern, and that's the concern that we've been raising actively with Australia all throughout this process. Now, we haven't got them to change their view on this, but this is one of the two key concerns that we're raising time and again with Australia, is deporting people back to New Zealand who, other than their DNA, are really not New Zealanders. They were born here, they have citizenship, and that with that goes a whole lot of protections, but actually for a number of them, that is the extent of their connection. And that we absolutely agree that creates additional difficulties with reintegration of some of these offenders, and I think creates a very, very valid ground as to whether the moral view of whether they should be sent back is being properly applied. But as everyone in this House has acknowledged, we can all have views on that, we can all express them, I think many of us share them. Nonetheless, Australia have made their decisions, and there's a certain extent of also having to deal with it. So the bill is looking at the justice aspects of that. That's not to say that there aren't really important issues around things like health and education and welfare support and employment and financial assistance. And I can tell members in the House that agencies and ministers in those areas are actively working, Mr Chair, actively working to make sure that we have the right framework and advice and support in place. Once these offenders land in New Zealand, they are New Zealand citizens and they have access to exactly the same support, entitlements, assistance needs as their case warrants. And we all know that MSD and the like work through that on a case-by-case basis. Nonetheless, they have a particular piece of work to try and work through those issues. I don't purport to have provided for all that in this bill. This bill is about picking up the parole oversight part of the puzzle. I'm not saying that the rest is not critical. It is. I haven't seen anything that suggests legislative change was required, though. That piece is also going alongside it. The final comment I just want to make in this contribution on this part, because it is obviously the very reasonably functionary part of the bill. The next part is far more where the substance is, and so I want to save our time for that. But the other comment I am just going to make is it does seem somewhat incongruous that on the one hand this is being called rushed and it's all been rushed and crammed through, and on the other hand we've taken far too long. You can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. The one point I would make is that when Mr Goff said, why wasn't this legislation in the House a year ago? Well, Australia hadn't changed their law a year ago. We found out the 12th of February. We started work immediately. We haven't stopped work on it since the 12th of February. This is the process it takes to get into this place. I'm very proud that that process has worked well. Officials have had one hand tied behind their back trying to get information out of Australia. And frankly, people who think that you can just have an idea one night and then get it into legislation in the House or something this complex are revealing, I think, the fact that they haven't had ministerial roles dealing with issues of this complexity. And that doesn't even take into account, even Jacinda Ardern mentioned in her second reading contribution, Labor could never have done this because they didn't have the information sharing agreement in place. Well, exactly. We had to have the information. We now have that information and we've acted. So we started as soon as we found out. We haven't stopped. It's in the House quickly because it needs to be passed quickly. But to suggest that somehow nothing has happened and it could have happened a year ago is wrong and, frankly, belittles the debate that we should be having on this pretty important issue.
Mr Chair.
I call